We're talking about farms that so many families flock to on weekends and throughout the holidays, like Topaz Farm on Sauvie Island. You may have seen on social media this week cries for help from these farms and many others, saying the potential changes the state is talking about making.
In the quiet valleys and broad agricultural plains of Oregon, the hum of farm equipment and the steady rhythm of rural life had always been constants. That steady beat was interrupted abruptly when officials ordered multiple farms to halt operations. The decision came swiftly and without public forewarning, sending a ripple of unease through the farming community and beyond. This wasn't a small-scale disruption or a routine regulatory pause. It was a sweeping shutdown, one that came on the heels of a discovery so unsettling that even seasoned agricultural inspectors were left visibly shaken. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For generations, Oregon's farmland has been prized for its fertility and diversity of crops. Rows of vegetables, sprawling orchards, and clusters of livestock pastures have defined both the economy and the landscape. When state authorities step in to freeze such operations, it signals more than just an economic hiccup. The shutdown was not about market prices or seasonal crop rotation. It was tied to an event that challenged both the safety of the food supply and the perception of rural resilience. The fields that had, until days before, been symbols of abundance now sat eerily silent, machinery idle and barns locked tight under official orders. The roots of the shutdown traced back to a series of inspections that had started quietly but escalated quickly. Agricultural health monitors, responding to what was initially described as anomalous environmental readings, began testing soil and water sources on several farms. What they found didn't align with ordinary contamination patterns or pest infestations. These readings suggested the presence of something foreign, something that didn't fit any known local or regional profiles. Early reports hinted at an invasive element with properties that defied standard categorization. Not just a plant disease, not just a chemical contaminant, but a hybrid threat that combined aspects of both. By the time confirmation came in from the laboratories, the urgency had already spread behind closed doors in state agencies. Officials were briefed in tense, closed-door sessions. The fear wasn't simply about crop loss or damaged soil. It was about what might happen if this contaminant spread unchecked. The potential vectors were not limited to wind or water. There were signs it could be carried by insects, possibly even by animals moving between farms. That meant containment was a race against both time and nature, a race in which hesitation could allow the unknown agent to leap far beyond its initial detection zone. When the shutdown orders went out, farmers were blindsided. Some learned about it when state vehicles rolled onto their property with warning signs and enforcement officers. Fields were cordoned off with temporary fencing, and certain areas were marked as strictly off-limits. No harvesting, no planting, no transport of existing goods. The goal was absolute containment. Farmers who had weathered floods, droughts, and market collapses before said they had never seen measures this drastic. It wasn't only the speed of the shutdown, but the way it seemed to suggest that authorities feared an immediate and potentially irreversible chain reaction if farming activity continued. The local communities, deeply intertwined with the land, began to feel the effects almost immediately. In small towns, agricultural commerce is the lifeblood, from the morning market where local produce is sold to the supply stores that cater to planting and harvesting needs. As the farms fell silent, so did much of the town's economic heartbeat. But the fear went deeper than lost sales. Whispers spread about what exactly had been found in the fields, each rumor more unsettling than the last. Without official details, speculation ranged from experimental pathogens to environmental sabotage. The fact that state officials refused to name the threat outright only heightened the sense that this was not an ordinary agricultural hazard. Scientists brought in to study the affected areas worked in full protective gear. This wasn't just standard biohazard precaution. It was reinforced equipment designed for scenarios where airborne transmission could not be ruled out. Their sampling was methodical, moving from soil to water to plant tissue, then to the insects captured in fine mesh nets. Each sample was sealed in multiple layers of containment before being shipped to high-security laboratories. The presence of these specialists, combined with the sudden farm closures, left little doubt in people's minds that the problem was far more serious than any pest or weed Oregon had dealt with before. Some of the initial field observations hinted at the contaminant's peculiar behavior. Affected plants showed rapid and unnatural decay, but not in a way typical of fungal or bacterial infections. The breakdown of plant tissue appeared to accelerate under certain weather conditions, as if the agent responded to shifts in temperature or humidity. In some cases, soil samples taken from different depths showed varying levels of impact, suggesting that the threat might be capable of moving vertically through the earth rather than remaining near the surface. This adaptability made containment even more urgent, as the usual methods for halting soil-borne diseases, such as surface treatment or controlled burns, might not be enough. Adding to the complexity was the fact that livestock on some of the affected farms had begun to exhibit subtle but noticeable changes. While there were no immediate signs of illness severe enough to warrant mass culling, veterinarians noted irregularities in feeding behavior and physical restlessness. Whether this was directly tied to the contaminant or simply a stress response to environmental changes remained unclear. Still, the very possibility that it could cross into animal systems added a chilling new dimension to the problem. The economic implications were staggering even in the earliest days. Oregon's agricultural sector is a key supplier for much of the region, and a disruption of this magnitude could ripple outward to grocery chains, food processors, and export markets. Buyers quickly began to look for alternative sources, anticipating shortages or outright bans on certain products from the region. This, in turn, threatened to erode long-standing trade relationships that farmers had spent decades building. Even if the threat could eventually be contained, the reputational damage to Oregon's farm products might linger far longer. Behind the scenes, there were indications that the state was working in coordination with federal agencies. This collaboration was not unusual for large-scale agricultural threats, but the intensity of it, with federal scientists and security personnel moving alongside local inspectors, pointed toward a classification of risk that went beyond the typical scope of farm safety protocols. It raised questions about whether the discovery had any potential national security implications, a possibility that few wanted to voice openly, but that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. The terrain itself posed additional challenges for containment. Oregon's farming regions are a patchwork of open fields, rolling hills, and waterways that connect one property to another. These natural linkages, normally a blessing for irrigation and biodiversity, now became potential highways for the contaminant to spread. Authorities began deploying barriers along key irrigation channels and advising nearby farms outside the shutdown zone to implement emergency soil and water testing. Helicopters were spotted overhead, scanning the affected areas with equipment capable of detecting chemical signatures invisible to the naked eye. As days turned into weeks, the silence over the specifics of the contaminant became more pronounced. Farmers and residents were left balancing on a thin edge between wanting answers and fearing what those answers might reveal. In the absence of official explanations, communities began relying on their own networks to share observations, sometimes even comparing photographs of affected plants or water discoloration. This grassroots vigilance, while helpful for staying informed, also risked spreading misinformation that could fuel panic or lead to misguided attempts at self-remediation. What made the event even more unsettling was how abruptly it emerged. There had been no warning signs in the previous season, no gradual buildup of visible symptoms across the landscape. One week the fields were green and thriving, the next, parts of them were under quarantine. Such a rapid shift suggested either a sudden introduction of the contaminant or a dormant presence that had been triggered into activity. Both possibilities carried heavy implications. If it was sudden introduction, it raised questions of how and by whom. If it was a latent presence, it meant other areas might be unknowingly harboring the same risk, waiting for the right conditions to erupt. Farmers, many of whom had inherited their land through generations, found themselves in an impossible position. Their identities, livelihoods, and futures were tied to the soil now under suspicion. Even those outside the shutdown zones felt the tension, knowing that a single positive test could bring their operations to a standstill. Insurance in most cases did not cover the kind of losses incurred under such circumstances. The uncertainty was corrosive, gnawing at the stability of both family-run farms and larger commercial operations. Within academic circles, the event sparked urgent discussions. researchers in plant pathology, soil science, and environmental toxicology began speculating on the nature of the contaminant, trading theories, and calling for accelerated testing protocols. Some suggested that the characteristics being reported pointed to a bioengineered organism, while others leaned toward a rare but naturally occurring mutation. The lack of concrete data made every hypothesis provisional, but the diversity of the theories reflected just how unusual the situation was. The political dimension of the shutdown could not be ignored either. State leaders faced mounting pressure to balance transparency with caution. Too much information too soon could cause unnecessary alarm or harm ongoing investigations. Too little information could erode public trust and fuel conspiracy theories. The decision to prioritize containment over disclosure was a calculated risk, one that aimed to prevent escalation but also left space for speculation to grow unchecked. Meanwhile, the land itself stood as a stark reminder of what was at stake. The sight of once busy farms lying dormant carried a haunting weight. Rows of unharvested crops began to wither in the sun, their decline a visual echo of the urgency that had frozen all activity. In some areas, signs warning of restricted access were the only movement in fields that had, until recently, been alive with seasonal labor. Even the air felt different, heavier, as if holding the unspoken knowledge of what had been found beneath the soil and in the water. The implications stretched far beyond the immediate crisis. If Oregon's fertile valleys could be brought to a halt by a single, poorly understood threat, it raised broader questions about the vulnerability of modern agriculture. The interconnected nature of the food supply means that a disruption in one region can have cascading effects across states and even countries. In an era when farming relies not just on natural cycles but on global trade and distribution, such an event revealed how fragile the system could be in the face of the unexpected. There was also the matter of precedent. By acting decisively and shutting down operations, Oregon set a new standard for response to agricultural anomalies. Future incidents, whether in Oregon or elsewhere, might now be judged against this event. Was it an overreaction or a necessary measure? That debate was already beginning in quiet corridors, but for the farmers on the ground, the question was secondary to the immediate reality. Their fields were closed, their work suspended, and their futures uncertain. The ripple effect into related industries was immediate. Food processing plants that relied on local produce began operating at reduced capacity. Trucking companies faced sudden gaps in their schedules with shipments canceled or rerouted. Even restaurants that prided themselves on using locally sourced ingredients had to adjust their menus overnight. This disruption revealed just how deeply embedded the farms were in every layer of the local economy. And yet, despite the economic and logistical turmoil, the primary concern remained the same as it had been from the moment the shutdown began: containment. Every day that passed without new zones being quarantined was counted as a small victory. Every negative test result from a neighboring farm brought a measure of relief. But beneath those moments of reassurance ran an undercurrent of vigilance, the awareness that the threat, whatever it was, might still be moving unseen. The shutdown of Oregon's farms did not just suspend agricultural work, it altered the rhythm of the entire rural environment. The absence of human activity on the land had an immediate impact on the landscape itself. With tractors idle and irrigation schedules halted, certain fields began to change in unexpected ways. In some areas, wild plants and grasses moved in quickly, taking advantage of the sudden lack of cultivation. In others, the soil appeared oddly stagnant, with moisture patterns shifting in ways that puzzled local agronomists. Without the regular turnover of soil and the flow of irrigation channels, micro-ecosystems began developing in places where uniform crop rows had dominated for years. The wildlife reacted as well. Deer, coyotes, and smaller mammals that typically kept to the outskirts of farmland began wandering closer to barns and silos. Birds congregated in unusual patterns, especially around standing water that had been left untended since irrigation pumps stopped. While this might have looked like a return to a more natural balance, the proximity of animals to quarantined land raised additional concerns. Any creature crossing those boundaries could unknowingly carry the contaminant elsewhere, potentially undermining the very containment strategies that had forced the shutdown in the first place. This created a strange paradox. The quieter and more natural the land seemed, the more dangerous it might have been. The economic shock deepened with each passing day. Seasonal workers who depended on harvest jobs found themselves without income or clarity on when work might resume. Many had already committed to living arrangements near the farms, unable to simply move on to other regions. Small suppliers, from fertilizer distributors to feed mills, faced their own crisis, with products going unsold and warehouses filling up. The interdependence between farms and these peripheral businesses became painfully clear, revealing just how fragile the rural economic network could be when one major link was severed. In regional agricultural policy circles, the Oregon shutdown quickly became a case study in high-stakes decision-making under uncertainty. Experts debated whether the state had acted preemptively enough or whether earlier detection methods could have prevented the need for such an expansive halt. Conversations turned toward the limitations of current monitoring systems. While farms undergo routine checks for pests and diseases, few programs are designed to detect hybrid threats with both biological and chemical properties. This gap in preparedness was now glaring, prompting discussions about the need for new surveillance technologies that could scan for anomalies in real time. The social impact ran deeper than economics and policy. Rural communities often see farming as not just a profession, but a cultural identity. The act of planting, tending, and harvesting is woven into local traditions, celebrations, and even family dynamics. With those activities suddenly stripped away, there was a palpable sense of loss. Longtime farmers, who had weathered decades of good and bad seasons, found themselves untethered from the routines that defined their lives. Some described it as an invisible wall between themselves and the land. Their property was still there, but their role in shaping it had been suspended indefinitely. In nearby schools, the shutdown became a topic of constant discussion. Many students came from farming families, and the uncertainty at home seeped into classrooms. Teachers found themselves fielding questions they could not answer, especially from children trying to understand why their parents could no longer work the fields. Some school programs that relied on local produce for cafeteria meals had to make abrupt shifts to out-of-state suppliers, creating an odd disconnect between lessons on supporting local agriculture and the reality playing out just beyond the school grounds. At research facilities brought in to analyze the contamination, the work was intense and unrelenting. Teams were divided into highly specialized groups. Some focused on genetic sequencing to determine if the agent was engineered or naturally occurring, others on chemical analysis to identify any synthetic compounds that might have combined with biological matter. The presence of multiple disciplines under one investigative roof underscored the complexity of the problem. Early findings indicated that the contaminant had a structural stability unusual for natural pathogens, raising questions about whether it had been deliberately introduced or whether it represented an evolutionary outlier that had emerged spontaneously. The possibility of deliberate introduction, though unconfirmed, was a thread that investigative agencies could not ignore. Agricultural sabotage is not unheard of in history, and modern agriculture's reliance on monocultures can make entire regions susceptible to targeted attacks. The idea that such a scenario could be unfolding in Oregon, a state known for its agricultural diversity and sustainability efforts, sent shockwaves through security circles. Quiet inquiries began into recent activity in and around the affected areas, including the movement of goods, unusual purchases of chemicals, and even unexplained drone sightings over farmland in the weeks before the shutdown. Meanwhile, the environmental stakes grew higher. Oregon's farmland is interlaced with watersheds that eventually feed into major river systems. If the contaminant reached those waterways, containment could become virtually impossible. Water testing expanded far beyond the immediate shutdown zone, with samples taken from tributaries, reservoirs, and even private wells. The state imposed temporary restrictions on the use of certain water sources for irrigation outside the affected farms, a measure that frustrated some farmers but was deemed essential to prevent unintentional spread. The shutdown also had a profound effect on local food markets. Small grocery stores and farm-to-table restaurants had built their brands on offering fresh, locally grown produce. Overnight, they had to replace Oregon-grown goods with products shipped in from hundreds of miles away. For consumers who had long championed the buy local ethos, the change was a sobering reminder of how dependent they were on the stability of their immediate agricultural network. Some markets tried to highlight unaffected farms from other parts of the state, but the shadow of the contamination hung over all Oregon produce, making customers hesitant. Culturally, the incident began to seep into art, media, and conversation. Local radio stations aired call-in shows where residents shared memories of past agricultural crises and speculated about the current one. Musicians began writing songs that touched on the tension between human ambition and nature's unpredictability. Photographers documented the eerie stillness of the fields, capturing images of abandoned equipment, empty produce crates, and the stark contrast between quarantined and unaffected land. The event became more than a practical challenge. It became part of the region's collective story. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Oregon shutting down farms after this terrifying event? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.